Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am C. Raghava Reddy, belonging to the Department of Sociology, University of Hyderabad, Hyderabad. The module name we are going to discuss is sampling, and it is part of the paper Methodology of Research in Sociology. Sampling is an important aspect of social science research. Every social scientist grapples with the issues of sampling at the time of research. How few respondents are selected from a population becomes very critical in every social science research, because the findings and the conclusions drawn by the researchers has to be technically correct. For the conclusions to be technically correct, the sampling has to be technically right. In this sense, sampling assumes greater significance. In this module, we are going to discuss the issues associated with sampling. It focuses basically on the logical basis of sampling. It gives the meaning of sampling, and also it discusses the terms associated with sampling. Sampling is an important procedure in social research which deals with the selection of elements or units from a large population. The researcher collects data from these set of elements or units for research. The aim of this module is to make you familiarize with the meaning and purpose of sampling, advantages and limitations of sampling, and relevant terms used in sampling. Before we go into the details of sampling, let us first make the meanings and usage of certain terms like population and elements clear. The term element here refers to the unit of study from which data are collected. The elements referred to in sampling could be individual respondents, households, villages, organizations, or even states in a country. Elements are those from whom data are collected. The term population refers to collection of those units or elements which possess similar characteristics. It consists of a number of elements whose number may range from hundreds to lakhs. For example, the number of Kathak dancers in India is in hundreds, whereas the number of farmers in the country is in crores. Population is also often referred to as universe. However, the difference between the two is that universe is a conceptual category while population is an operational category. Universe is aggregate of all units possessing certain characteristics. A sample is supposed to represent universe. For example, the conceptual category of the universe in a study on farm crisis at small and marginal farmer level refers to all the small and marginal farmers of the country. The operational category of the universe of the study may be small and marginal farmers located in a particular district or region. Universe can be either finite or infinite. A finite universe will have identifiable number of elements, for example, voters of a country. In the case of infinite universe, the number of elements is indeterminable or cannot be identified. For example, the number of persons communicated through email in a day. It is something similar to stars in the sky, which is difficult to be counted, or leaves on a neem tree. When it comes to population, the elements in the population are identifiable and reachable. In most cases, the term population refers to a specific geographic area. The sampling frame is prepared considering the population of the study. Sampling. Sampling is the process of systematic selection of elements from a population of interest, so that by studying the sample, a researcher can fairly generalize the results about the population. Size of population ranges from few individuals, for example, nuclear scientists in the country, to a very large number, for example, school-going children in the country. In the first example, it is fairly less difficult for a researcher to identify the population for the study, as the number of scientists specialized in nuclear science in the country is less. Given the resources and time, sometimes researcher might collect data from entire population. Operational, technical and material constraints of research may demand collection of data from a set of elements drawn from population instead. If data are collected from all the elements of population, it is referred to as census data. If data are collected from few select respondents, it is referred to as sample data. The important issue here is that how the researcher arrives at generalizations or explanations about population based on the data collected from a sample. Sampling involves selection of some or all elements of population with an intention to explain the properties of population. Sampling thus pertains to selection of certain elements from a large or small population. The elements selected for systematic observation or data collection through various methods are referred to as sample. A sample is a finite part of a population whose properties are studied to explain about the whole. The size of the sample need not be in proportion to the size of population. Studying all elements from a very large population is usually not possible for any researcher. At another level, social research does not necessarily demand data collection from entire population. In fact, it is considered as meaningless to collect data from entire population. When it is not useful to collect data from all elements in the population, or it is impractical or impossible to deal with all elements, then sampling is undertaken. Sampling is not entirely new and unknown to us. In fact, in our day-to-day life, we practice sampling in various contexts. Take the example of us when we go to buy rice or wheat from a grocery store. How do we judge the quality of grains in a bag of rice? Do we check the entire bag to know the quality of rice in the bag? We just take a handful of rice grains from the bag and decide the quality of rice in that particular bag. Here, rice in the particular bag can be considered as the population and few grains which we collect from the bag as the sample. Is sampling such a simple exercise? Just hold on. It is not that simple, because how do we know that the handful of grains we collect from the bag represent the grains in the entire bag? If there are 10 bags of rice, then can this handful of rice from one bag be used to determine the quality of rice in all the 10 bags? The important question that emerges here is whether the sample we choose is representing the entire population, because a sample is subjected to measurement assuming that it represents the entire population. A representative sample is the one that represents the entire population. What do we do with a sample study? Through data collected from the sample, we arrive at an aggregate value called as statistic. Using the statistic, we aim to estimate a population parameter. For example, average age of students in a college may be calculated by using a sample. The average age we calculate is used to make observations about the age of students in the college as a whole. Such statement based on sample result is probability statement. They are probable statements because the average we arrive at is not a fact. We collect data on age from all the students in the college. We would arrive at a factual figure. While the census value is a fact, the sample value is an estimate. We call sample value as an estimate because the value is not based on the information from all the students in the college. Estimate also brings in the issue of its precision. How precise this estimate can take us close to the population value. Closeness to the correct population value is referred to as accuracy. Since population value is seldom known to the researcher, the sample value gives us probable accuracy, which is otherwise called as precision. In statistics, the fact is supported by normal distribution. Suppose we collect data on marks in a particular subject from a sample of 100 students drawn from a population of 1000 students and calculate the mean. The mean mark thus obtained from the sample is used to estimate the mean mark for the population. The value we derive from the sample is used to explain for the population. This value from the sample is known as statistic. To what extent the mean marks calculated for 100 students is accurate to explain the mean marks for 1000 students? Generally, the statistic we arrive at is close to the population value, that is parameter. Normally, the mean marks for 100 students may be slightly high or low from the mean marks of the population. However, in many cases, we do not know the mean value of the population. For example, average income of farmers in the country. Hence, the statistic we arrive at from the sample is always referred to as an estimate. Then, the next question that arises here is how many samples should be drawn from a population to arrive at a statistic which is close to a parameter. Is it sufficient to draw one sample and arrive at a statistic? Theoretically, infinite or any number of samples can be drawn from a population. However, in practice, a researcher does not draw several samples and instead confines to a single sample. This is because even if more than one sample is drawn, no two samples would produce the same estimate. However, the average of different sample estimates is more likely equivalent to the population average. Imagine we take several samples of same size from a population and calculate the average. Then calculate the average of averages of different samples we have drawn. The average of averages is likely to be equivalent to the population mean. This is explained in statistics by standard normal distribution. Let us look at the example of students' marks in the given figure. Suppose we draw several samples of a particular size, for example 100 out of 1000 students, and estimate the mean marks of the samples and plot the averages on a bar graph. We can find from figure 1 that most of the averages converge on the same central value and fewer averages are located either high or low from the central value. In other words, the bar graph produces a bell curve which is an indication of normal distribution. Then let us look at what the normal curve is. The normal curve is a smooth unimodal curve that is perfectly symmetrical. It is a bell-shaped curve in which the mean, median and mode coincide at the peak. In normal curve, one half of the curve is the mirror image of the other half. The area under each half can be divided into smaller portions. The center of the normal curve is considered as 0 point. Moving further right or left from the center, we can divide it into equal interval widths as +1, +2 or +3, and similarly -1, -2 and -3. These points are known as standard deviate points. As presented in the figure, the area between 0 point and +1 or -1 point is 34.13%. In other words, the area under normal curve between +1 standard deviate points and 0, that is central of the normal curve, is 68.26%. The area between +2 is 95.44% and between +3 is 99.74%. Statisticians have developed a table showing the area under normal curve in each half. What are these standard deviate points and the percentage of area under normal curve? The standard deviate points indicate the spread of scores around the average, that is the central point in the bell curve, in a single sample. We know that If we calculate average marks in a test for 100 students, we get one single value, that is mean. Here in normal curve, mean mark is located at the center with 0 standard deviate points. Obviously, you will find that many students who have scored higher or lower marks than the mean marks. These high or low marks from the mean are indicated by standard deviate points. Statistically, using a particular score, for example, a student's marks and mean marks for the sample, we can say how many students scored marks between the mean and the particular marks of the student. This explanation is something beyond the single value, that is mean. With the mean, we would have explained only the mean marks of students. But to explain how many students scored between mean, for example 58 marks and 75 marks. For this, we need to calculate the standard deviate units. The expression of this calculation is raw score minus the mean divided by the standard deviation. Standard deviation for a given sample can be calculated by using mean value and sample size. Standard deviation is obtained by first subtracting the mean from every test score, then squaring the difference between the mean and the test score, summing up the squares, dividing the number of cases, and finally taking the square root. Using a normal curve, we can infer population values from sample statistics. If we draw fixed size samples repeatedly and calculate the means cluster around the mean of the population. As stated earlier, the mean of the sample means will equal the mean of the population. The important point to remember here is that the population should have a normal distribution. However, the population does not always have a normal distribution. According to the law of large numbers, the distribution of sample means will approximate a normal curve when the sample size is greater than 30. Thus, sample size matters a lot in making statistically valid claims about population. As the sample size increases, the scope for sampling errors decreases. A low sampling error means less variability in the sampling distribution. Great variation in sampling distribution gives higher sample standard deviation. Higher the sample standard deviation, greater is the sampling error. Imagine if we collect data from entire population, we wouldn't be worrying about sampling error because we are talking about all the cases in the population. Thus, sampling error does not occur. Sampling error occurs only when we select some elements from population as sample. Statisticians suggest that to overcome the problems of sampling errors, the sample size must be high and sample should have been drawn using random probability sampling procedures. This takes us to the principle of sampling. What is the principle of sampling? Sampling is based on the principle that when a moderately large number of elements are chosen for a sample following random sampling procedures, the sample is more likely to possess the characteristics of the population. Inherent to this principle are two conditions. These are: sample should be drawn randomly, that is, random principle tells that every unit in the population has an equal known non-zero probability of being selected to the sample. The human involvement in the selection of sample elements is minimal in random sampling procedures. Second, the sample should be representative of the population. The principle of large numbers suggests that large numbers have greater stability, steadiness, and consistency than smaller ones. It states that larger is the size of the sample, more equal is the spread of units in the sample to be. It is based on the principle that the movement in individual components of a population has a tendency to cancel out each other. While some move in one direction, others move in a direction which is exactly opposite. Therefore, if the sample is large enough, the average is always representative of both tendencies. The normal distribution explains the fact that a majority of the mean values we obtain from different samples is more or less same with a small variation between them. Too high or too low values would be very few. That is why it is stated that average of averages is equivalent to the population mean. Normal distribution is distributed symmetrically about its mean with a large number of small deviations from the mean and few large ones. Normal distribution has many day-to-day applications. For example, body mass index, which tells us the ideal weight of a normal person based on her or his weight. We can see that a large majority fall within the range of weight given in the chart. However, we can also find people whose weight is either too high or too low. Next, we look at sample size. How big should be the sample size? Statisticians suggest that larger sample size overcomes the problem of error in estimate. The larger the sample size, the lower is the sampling error. However, sample size is also determined by other constraints such as budget, time, and manpower. The size of the sample depends on the characteristics of the population. If the population is homogeneous, a sample of one element of the entire population is sufficient. For example, a single drop of blood in blood tests. The size of sample is also influenced by the precision of the results desired by the researcher. If the researcher decides for an intensive examination of population properties, then a large sample may be necessary. Researcher goes for a small sample when the errors associated with small sample studies do not undermine the findings of the study. Finally, sample size depends upon the level of confidence at which the researcher decides for the estimates. Higher level of confidence demands large sample size and vice versa. Of course, size of sample varies with the methods of data collection. Survey researchers place greater emphasis on calculation of sample size to make the data claims valid. They adopt mathematical calculations to arrive at a number for sample size. In survey research, the researcher has to answer certain questions about accuracy of the result. For example, how accurately the data finding should be, and level of confidence at which survey results are explained, and the awareness of population mean or expectations. In survey research, sample size is calculated before the beginning of data collection. Using a formula, one can calculate the sample size. As far as size of sample in qualitative research is concerned, there are no defining rules to guide the selection. It depends on the objectives of the research project, nature of research questions, resources at disposal, researchers' familiarity with the field, and time. We come across certain sociological studies on social phenomena with a smaller sample size conducted with great intensity. Often referred to as purposeful sampling, the sample is judged based on the purpose and rationale of the study rather than on statistical procedure. However, the validity of the insights of such research is based on the richness of data collected and analytical capability of the researcher and theoretical rendering to the findings. Advantage of sampling. Sampling enables researcher to collect data from few elements or units of the population with less effort and expenditure. Collection of data from few elements does not affect generalization of findings to the population. For example, national sample survey, exit polls, etc. By focusing on a sample, data can be collected with more rigor and intensity. Sampling also reduces the burden of data analysis as information is collected from a few elements. Sampling provides quicker results as the time consumed for data collection and analysis is less. The findings of the research study can be arrived at in a less time. If the population is infinite, sampling is the only procedure possible. For example, in studies related to customers' feedback or consumer behavior or public opinion, the population is infinite. Limitations of sampling. Sampling is not free from certain limitations. These limitations are important to consider making generalizations for the population. The basic limitations are: the researcher is expected to possess adequate knowledge of sampling methods and procedures. Inaccurate sampling results in incorrect and often misleading generalizations. It is not easy to ensure the representativeness of the sample. Therefore, sampling results in sampling errors. Terms used in sampling. Population. The term population refers to a group of elements or units related to the problem of research. Sample. A sample is a finite part of population whose properties are studied to explain about the whole. Sampling error. The error which arises because of studying only a part of the total population, that is sample, is called as sampling error. Statistic. Statistic is the summary value of a variable calculated from a sample. For example, average age of students. Parameter. Parameter is the summary value of the variable in the population that the researcher is trying to estimate. For example, average age of students in the school. Estimate. An estimate is the value obtained by using the method of estimation for a specific sample. For example, mean age of the students from the sample is an estimator for the age of students in a school. Sampling frame. The sampling frame contains all the population elements or units. It is a list of population elements from which the sample is drawn. Sampling bias. Sampling bias is a tendency to favor the selection of units that have particular characteristics into the sample. Sampling bias is different from sampling error. Sampling error may be reduced by increasing the sample size, but sampling bias may not be reduced. Unlike sampling error, sampling bias cannot be measured. Sampling bias arises due to non-adherence to random sampling procedures, omission of specific subgroups within a population, inaccurate sampling frame, problem with questionnaire or interview schedule used to collect data, and non-response by a specific subgroup in the sample. So far, in this module on sampling, we have looked at the issues associated with sampling. We have looked at the meaning of sample, what is the logical basis of sampling, and other terms associated with sampling like statistic, parameter, sampling frame, population, etc. It is important for the social science researchers to take the sampling stage seriously in their research process. Hope this module helps them to understand the importance and criticality of sampling in the research process.